I was born in a refugee camp in Germany in 1949. I say that because I've said that line about 1,000 times in my life. The story is familiar. My parents were refugees from Latvia during World War II. We moved to the United States, and the first time I ever appeared in public in kindergarten, and I had to introduce myself to Americans, and I said my name was Ojars Kalnins. I got looks of bewilderment, and they asked me, "What is that?" And I said, "It's a Latvian name." And they said, "What's a Latvian?" I said, "Somebody from Latvia." "Where's that?" And I realized from childhood that I had to start explaining my country, because back then in the 50s in the US and probably in most parts of the world, nobody knew anything about a country called Latvia. And so one of the things I realized early on is that the best way to tell a story about my country is to personalize it, because it's basically the story of my family, the story of the other families I knew, how we got to the United States, why we got there. In the 90s, after some other jobs, I ended up becoming a diplomat. I became Latvia's ambassador to the United States. And what I realized was that a diplomat and a statesman, when talking about their country, tends to talk about principles, about policies. But ultimately, and the only people who actually care about those principles and policies are other diplomats and other statesmen and other politicians. But if you want to get through to a wider audience, you have to talk about the people. Your country consists of people, not of policies. And that's where stories come in. When I was ambassador, one of the things I realized, you get a lot of courtesy visits from other ambassadors. And I always looked into the biographies of these other ambassadors to find out a little bit more about their personal interests, whether they're interested in sports or culture or nature. And then I tried to hone in on that. Yes, we had 15, 20 minutes talk about Latvian-German or Latvian-Austrian relations. But if I knew that they were a fan of opera, I could immediately start talking about Latvia's opera singers or choir singers. If they were hockey fans, I immediately had something to talk about. And again, even on a one-to-one level, in addition to talking about policy, you talked about people, you talked about culture, about traditions. You made this personal contact. After serving as ambassador for 7 years, I moved to Latvia in 2000 permanently, and I took over the Latvian Institute, which was basically our public relations agency, our public information agency, designed to try to provide information about Latvia. And that was our full-time job, is to try to fill this void of information. And yes, we did some of the traditional things. We wrote about history and culture and so on. But again, we tried to tell stories, because that was the way to get through to people. And to me, one of the more interesting and successful projects that we ended up with was in the 60s, a Latvian emigre named Ojars Kalnins in Sweden wrote a book about Latvian history in Latvian. In English, it's called the Latvian Saga. He wrote this book as a popular history for the children of Latvian emigres in the West, to inform them about their country that they had never lived in and knew very little about. And it was written in a very popular language. Perhaps serious historians would say this isn't academic history, but it got through to the young people. And in the late 90s, the Latvian Institute translated this book into English. It's called the Latvian Saga. And I think to this day, it's probably still the most popular and most accessible book of Latvian history. And again, historians will say this is a little bit populist, but it's all stories. Maybe some of it is a little bit mythical, but it's something that gets through. And at least when I talk to non-Latvians who have read this, it's the first history book that's gotten them interested in the country. 10 years ago, next year we're celebrating our 100th anniversary. 10 years ago, we did a big campaign on Latvia's 90th anniversary. And I was still at the Institute at that time, and I was tasked to write blogs, short little vignettes about Latvia, history, culture, tradition. And they were short and they were sweet, but they got out there. They got the information out there in a way to a lot of different people. A long time ago, prior to my political work with Latvia, I started my career in advertising, and I was a copywriter. And in my first job, my boss sat me down and he said, when you sit down to write something, the first thing you have to keep in mind is nobody is interested in what you have to say. Nobody has the time, nobody has the interest. If you can't get their attention with the first sentence, then you've lost them. You're not a college professor. You don't have a captive audience that's forced to listen to you lecture for an hour. You've got to keep it short, you've got to keep it sweet, and you've got to relate it to your audience. And I think this is something that's essential. It's what Jānis was talking about. Those of us who are in government, again, tend to focus on policy and on very complex technical explanations. But if we want to reach more than our peers, if we want to reach the average public or even journalists, we've got to be able to talk about these things in a very, perhaps not simple way, but in a way that people can relate to. And just on a final point, we're talking today about information warfare, and social media, Twitter, Facebook, they've changed everything. In a way, they've made it a lot easier to reach people. It's also made it a lot easier to fool people. And most of the time now, when StratCom is dealing with fake news, disinformation, it seems like the people who know how to manipulate these new digital social media are perhaps ahead of the game, and they're doing a much better job of creating misinformation. But there's no reason why those of us who are trying to counter that can't do the same thing. And again, for somebody who started his career in advertising, to me, this era of Facebook postings, a headline, a picture, a short message, is the best way to reach people, because I know studies have been made, and there's the son of the architect who designed the library, the National Library of Latvia, Sven Birkerts, is a college professor in the US. He teaches literature, and he's written several books on the fact that the new social digital media has changed the attention span of people, and that his students don't want to read books anymore. They don't want to read long novels. They don't even want to go near War and Peace because it's just too long. They don't have the interest or the attention span. They want things in short sound bites. And unfortunately, that's what we have to deal with. We want to communicate with people. And perhaps, and again, maybe from an advertising point of view, a headline and a picture doesn't tell the full story, but it's like the shop window in front of a store. It's the way you get their attention to get them to come into the store. If you can catch their attention in the store window, and then they come in, then perhaps you've got their attention. You could spend the time to tell a longer and a more detailed story. But we've got to learn how to use the tools and the mechanisms that are given to us today. And most of all, you've got to be able to relate to your audience. You have to understand their education level, their interest level, and relate your message to them. I think we're doing it, and I'll just finish on the point that I personally am very proud of what Latvia has achieved with the StratCom Excellence Center here. I'm also very proud that we got the European Union to start doing the same thing in 2015 with their East StratCom task force. And I think this is the way to go. We've got to deal with this. We've got to find better ways to relate to people, and I think we're moving in the right direction. So I'm very happy about this conference, and again, I want to congratulate Jānis and all the people at StratCom, and I'm glad to see that more and more people from countries around the world are coming here, because this is a global project. It's not just a Latvian project, and it's dealing with global problems that each of our countries has to deal with. So, thank you.